sensationalist gossip or rigorous research? This is my review of Andrew Lownie's book entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, a dual biography of Prince Andrew and his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York. I'll share with you what I think are the most interesting pieces of information in the book, its main takeaways, and whether I think it's well researched, written, and above all, credible. Welcome to History Calling. If you're new here, I provide documentaries every week on all aspects of the past, but with a particular focus on royalty and the use of original sources. This is actually a bonus video that I'm doing to review this book, so just for the record, the format of this episode, which is an audio-only podcast with just a single title card, is actually completely at odds with what I usually do, which is to provide videos with constantly changing images and footage. I'm having to turn this one around very quickly though in order to get the review out while the book is still a new release, which is why I've gone for this very simple approach. Also, there really aren't enough public domain or Creative Commons images and pieces of footage for me to use for a video about such recent history. A quick disclaimer before we proceed. A lot of what's in the book is speculation, and in repeating some of its claims, I'm not saying that such unverified stories are true, and I'm only offering my opinions on the book, its author, its subjects, the themes and events it describes, and anything else in it or to do with it. The book itself is linked in the description box for you, as are my other online platforms, including my Patreon site, website, and my own book, Finding Your Irish Ancestors Online. Okay, so let's start with a quick look at Entitled's author Andrew Lownie and at his credentials as an historian and a biographer for Prince Andrew and the Duchess of York. Lownie, and I'll be referring to him by surname only for the rest of the review to avoid confusion between him and Prince Andrew, has had a long career in book publishing and obtained a PhD in history by publication rather than by research from Edinburgh University in 2019. This means he didn't study for it for 3 or 4 years with a supervisor in the more traditional way, but rather submitted a piece of work he'd already published, which was accepted by the university. This is an unusual but totally accepted route to a PhD, and I mention it only as a little point of interest. His doctorate, which was obtained before or just as he began work on this book, combined with his lengthy history of writing well-received biographies of other historical figures, including British royals, means that I feel his credentials are sound. Lownie has stated that research for this book, the main text of which runs to 385 pages, took 4 years, beginning soon after Prince Andrew's now infamous Newsnight interview in late 2019. He states that he spoke to around 300 people and tracked down many documents relating to Prince Andrew and the Duchess of York, which all sounds great and is commendable. However, I have to point out that the bibliography is only 4.5 pages long and includes mostly secondary books and memoirs. Where are the archival sources he was able to access, or a list of the newspapers consulted and the video interviews he clearly watched, to give just a few examples, plus a list of all the interviews he himself conducted, though you might say the list of people in the acknowledgements is intended to cover this. It's really just a select bibliography. Furthermore, there are some large, if unavoidable, holes in his research, which I'd like you to bear in mind going forwards, and some of the sources are pretty questionable. First and foremost, this is an unauthorized biography, so he did not have the cooperation of his subjects, Prince Andrew and the Duchess of York, or of their family or close friends. In fact, he said that he actually approached 3,000 people for interviews and only 10% were willing to speak to him, which will have limited the quantity and quality of his information right away. There really wasn't anything Lownie could do about this though, and I appreciated his honesty about the matter. Second, he has stated himself that he was prevented from accessing many documents pertaining to Andrew and Sarah by archives he approached, which he says gave him the runaround much of the time, citing various reasons as to why they couldn't let him see what he was asking for, such as security concerns or saying that material wasn't available. Again, not something he can be blamed for, but it goes back to the issue of quantity and quality of sources. Third, this will by its nature be an incomplete biography of the Yorks because their stories aren't over yet, they're still alive. Fourth, we can't know if all the people who did speak to Lownie told the truth. There are lots of reasons why they may have provided inaccurate information, from having an axe to grind with one or more of the Yorks or their wider family, to wanting their own 15 minutes of fame, to genuine errors in memory. Some are also quoted anonymously in the book, so we can't go to them ourselves and interrogate their stories or ask follow-up questions, and on the whole, I found that there wasn't a lot of source analysis here. Though Lownie did note cases where people gave conflicting views of the Duke and Duchess and their behaviour, thereby offering some balance, he wasn't particularly prone to stopping and discussing whether his sources were reliable. He would just explain how they would know something about Andrew or Sarah, they'd worked with, dated, or even just met one of them, for instance, and there wouldn't be any further discussion about their credibility or reliability. Their accounts seem to me to have been mostly accepted at face value. When one looks at the endnotes at the back of the book, something I also observed was that a lot of them were to other secondary sources and newspaper articles, sometimes tabloids, or books published by ex-members of staff who might themselves be accused of sensationalizing matters to get attention, or books and interviews by the Yorks which we can assume would be intended to show them in the best possible light. Other citations might be to a newspaper, which had in turn just quoted an anonymous source, so again, there's no way to follow up on the information and check it. You should also bear in mind that, like pretty much all authors, Lownie will have his own agenda here, even if it's just as simple as wanting to write a well-received book that makes him plenty of money. As one of my tutors said when I was an undergrad, and it was a great piece of advice that's always stuck with me, everyone has a bias. Our job as historians is to figure out what it is and allow for it as much as possible. I don't know if Lownie has any other bias or aim apart from making money. It's worth noting that he's already planning a revised paperback and soliciting submissions for it, but as a general rule, I believe that books that make sensationalist claims about living royals are more likely to do well than very staid, respectful, inoffensive, run-of-the-mill biographies. So you may choose to believe that some of the contents have been invented or exaggerated to make this work more appealing to as wide an audience as possible. That's up to you. Just remember that just because someone says something doesn't mean it's true, and in fact you'll be hearing about one story in particular involving Prince Harry, which the Duke of Sussex has specifically said is false. I ended the book thinking that the broad picture of the Duke and Duchess of York, which is not flattering for the most part, is probably true enough, as it's in line with what I've heard about them from numerous other sources, such as news stories and documentaries, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of the details and anecdotes given in the book are not. Let's move on now to the book's contents. I'm going to look at what I think are the 5 main themes of the work. These are Prince Andrew and the Duchess's childhoods and personalities, their relationship with each other and their children over the decades, their official roles within the Navy, Andrew only of course, and royal family, their wider business interests and messy finances, and of course their dealings with disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein, his sometime girlfriend Ghislaine Maxwell, and the scandal that led to Prince Andrew essentially being fired as a working royal. Prince Andrew is presented in this book as having been a spoilt brat from the time he was born, who got a £4,000 mini Aston Martin for his 6th birthday, had his name read out first in roll call in school simply because of who he is, and was allowed to get away with stealing other little boys' belongings, a book of stamps to be precise, for the same reason. He apparently had no restraints on what he could do and no punishment for behaving badly up until his late middle age, and was very much indulged by the late Queen. He's also depicted as being academically very weak, very full of himself, a believer in his own great looks, obsessed with golf, emotionally stunted, and with a very lowbrow sense of humour, more befitting a 14-year-old boy than someone of his age and position. There are numerous tales of dirty, inappropriate jokes that only he laughs at a lot of the time, or his reliance on toilet humour. He comes across as being hyper-aware of his position and struggling to make friends, partly because of that, as he can't just relax with or trust people. Lownie actually evokes some sympathy for him on that front, in fact, pointing out that Andrew seems to have always been quite lonely, and he does give accounts from people who say the prince occasionally expressed a desire to not be royal. On the other hand, there are numerous reports too of his abominable treatment of staff, who he seems to view as barely human at times, and while I would remind you that not every story is necessarily true, I think Lownie has compiled a dossier which is too vast to be ignored and which is supported by other books and interviews already in the public domain. There's one on the Lad Bible Stories YouTube channel, for instance, which I'll leave linked below for you, with a former police officer who worked at Buckingham Palace. It includes a bizarre story about the adult prince having 72 teddies on his bed that have to be laid out in a specific manner, but it comes from a disgraced former police officer, so maybe that's why it's not included here. Just some of the stories that do make it into Lownie's book include the prince going berserk at one member of staff for not using the Queen Mother's full title, and at another, a chef this time, for not cutting up his meat properly at a dinner at Balmoral, only to then switch to being very nice by complimenting the same chef's Victoria sponge cake. He comes across as a Jekyll and Hyde character who is more often than not a Hyde. He's also presented as a prolific womanizer whose relationships rarely lasted and who has been involved with a string of totally inappropriate women for someone in his position. I completely lost track of the number of women he's meant to have been with, claimed to be over 1,000 at one point in the book, but I thought Lownie did a good job of showing what a terrible judge of character Andrew is and how he can place his personal pleasure above all else much of the time, thereby allowing people like models and actresses who'd appeared nude in movies or photo shoots into his bed, and, supposedly, even Russian spies who may have collected damaging information and maybe even photos or footage of him in compromising positions. This is in stark contrast to the other side of his personality, whereby he's so standoffish that he can barely make friends. I have to say, though, that something I didn't like about the book were the details given of both Andrew and Sarah's intimate lives with various partners. While I think there's certainly a case to mention things like that if there's an accusation that someone was coerced or otherwise harmed, and there are a couple of examples of that which we'll come to, generally speaking, I find it crass, appealing to the lowest common denominator, and just totally unnecessary and included only for shock value. The public doesn't need to know that kind of information, and while some nosy weirdos might want it, that doesn't mean they have a right to get it. There's not a lot of it in the book, but I didn't think it should have appeared at all outside the exception I've mentioned, nor did I think it was necessary to have fleeting mentions of Prince Philip's alleged affairs, including with Sarah's mother. This one was in the prologue, presumably to get us off to a scandalous start, as they added nothing to the narrative of Andrew and Sarah's lives. There was plenty to discuss without going down that route. On the subject of Andrew's love life, towards the end of the book, and I thought this should have appeared near the start because if it's true, it offers a real insight into his personality and later behaviour towards women, Lownie makes the extraordinary claim that Andrew first did the deed, I'm going to have to use a lot of roundabout language when discussing delicate matters to abide by YouTube's guidelines, when he was 11 years old. Now, the source for this assertion is given only as private information, along with another claim in the endnote that there was also inappropriate contact with a female member of staff at his school. But I really thought the author should have delved into this more deeply, as it was one of the most shocking and disturbing pieces of information in the book. If it's true, then the prince was a victim of you-know-what, starting with the letter R, and while it doesn't excuse the later behaviour he's accused of, from what Virginia Giuffre, formerly Roberts, said about him, to accusations of poor treatment of other women, including staff in his household, it does help to show how his personality developed. It also begs the question, where was his security at school? How could this have been allowed to happen to the Queen's 11-year-old son, apparently in a hotel and at the arrangement of one of his school friends' fathers? Why did no one involved do serious prison time? None of this is explained, and instead all we get is a very surface-level treatment of a story about him suffering extremely serious SA as a young child, which I found to be one of the most horrifying parts of the book. Moving on to the young Sarah Ferguson. I knew next to nothing about her past, so this was in many ways more interesting to me. She apparently comes from a pretty dysfunctional background and blamed herself for her mother losing her baby sister in 1969, soon after birth, only to then be abandoned by said mother in 1972 when she ran off to London, then Argentina with another man, something Sarah also blamed herself for. Side note, later in the book, Lownie says Sarah's mother was denied custody, which led me to wonder what exactly happened there and wish for a bit more clarity. Like the tale of Andrew at 11, I thought it was another instance of some confusingly organised information. Her sister then went to Australia when Sarah was 14, and altogether this series of events apparently led to problems around food and a desperate need to please others. Sarah is also not academically bright. She apparently got 2 O-levels, graduated joint bottom out of 200 girls at Secretarial College, and only got a job at a PR firm through nepotism. But what she did have was a very bubbly personality. She wasn't standoffish, and she could talk to anyone and put them at their ease, making her very different to her future husband. She had a couple of failed romances, and in particular what sounds like a pretty toxic relationship with the much older Paddy McNally, who cheated on her and undermined her confidence even further by making disparaging comments about her appearance. Again, I think when you know her background, it makes it easier to understand her personality and garners some sympathy for her. The two met as children, there's even a photograph of them in the early 1970s, but only got together because the Princess of Wales, frequently referred to as Princess Diana in the book, though that was never her legal title, was looking to hire Sarah as a lady-in-waiting and invited her to a Royal Ascot event in the summer of 1985, where she ended up sitting next to Prince Andrew. From there, the romance moved very fast, from dating in June 85 to engaged in February 1986 to married that July, even though Sarah's own father expressed concern that she was more interested in the royal family than in Andrew. Although marriage had apparently already been mooted, the actual form of the proposal really took me by surprise. The prince proposed in the midst or just after a snowball fight, and it was so off the cuff that Sarah was taken aback and offered to let him retract it. It doesn't seem well thought out or planned at all, rather like their whole lives together and separately. Lownie argues that the marriage was falling apart within weeks, partly because the couple weren't allowed to live together in naval barracks for security reasons, partly because when Andrew was home he was emotionally distant and preferred sitting watching the television than spending meaningful time with his wife, which left her feeling lonely, and partly because they both started cheating on each other pretty fast. One driver even said Andrew had slept with more than a dozen women before their first anniversary. In fact, the impression I got from this book was that the prince and royal life in general rubbed off on Sarah in the worst ways possible, with the new Duchess of York adopting her husband's spendthrift ways, laziness, an inflated opinion of herself and her position, and a high-handed manner of treating staff. The number of holidays she took, as laid out by Lownie, is absolutely shocking. 8 in 1990 and 7 in 1991, for instance. And I have to say that somewhere this book does well is in its reconstruction of a timeline for where this pair were much of the time. Fergie's volume of trips was matched only by the number of holidays her husband, later ex-husband, could fit in when not on naval duties. That brings us on to his career in the Navy, which is looked at in a fair amount of detail. Lownie's sources suggest that Andrew only got as far as he did in that organisation due to cheating and preferential treatment. He did well in the Falklands War and was in some real danger at times, but recollections vary about his personality. Some found him competent and willing to muck in, others found him standoffish. The publicity for it made him known as his royal heartthrob, however, and I have to say that as someone who wasn't even born yet at this stage, I did find Lownie's discussion of Andrew's now largely forgotten public popularity to be interesting and useful, as I think many people who weren't adults in the early 80s would, like me, know very little about this section of his life, and so wouldn't appreciate just how far he's fallen in the years since. That being said, I know that it's not new information, and that's a recurring problem in this book. It brings together a lot of details and fleshes out what we know about certain themes, but in my opinion, there's very little that's truly fresh, let alone bombshell material. Aside from the high point after the Falklands, the book contends that he threw his weight around, was a mediocre officer, and his test results on appraisals had to be inflated. One allegation, which stood out to me in particular, was that when required to write a paper for entry into the Army Staff College in 1992, he didn't do it, and 3 days before the deadline, his private secretary got another naval officer to do it for him, and that's part of how Andrew passed that course. Regarding structure, the book has another slight organisational issue for me when discussing the end of the Duke's career. It says on page 138 that it was decided that Andrew would retire in 1999, and because I don't remember the actual trajectory of his career, being only a child myself back then, I assumed that was what happened. I was therefore a bit surprised to get to page 183 and discover that it was only in 2001 that he actually retired, having been found a kind of stopgap job until then in the Directorate of Naval Operations. Andrew and Sarah's roles as working royals come in for considerable scrutiny as well, and the overall impression is of a couple who were out for minimal work, maximum gain, who didn't know how to conduct themselves properly and who were frankly too stupid and or lazy to learn. Prince Andrew undertook his first major overseas tour in April 1984 to represent the Queen at the 150th anniversary celebrations of St Helena and was made an aide-de-camp at the same time. However, this 24-year-old grown man rather spoiled the trip with his immature, unprofessional behaviour. He thought it would be funny to turn a spray gun on the reporters and photographers, causing £15,000 to £30,000 worth of damage to their equipment and presumably clothing, which the Queen made him pay for in what seems to have been a rare instance of him being held accountable for his actions. Lownie quotes a newspaper report from the Daily Express stating that Prince Andrew had blown the opportunity to show he was ready for royal responsibilities, and notes that from there on out he had to be accompanied, for which read babysat, by a PR person and equerry. Mind you, that doesn't seem to have improved matters much, and the book is absolutely littered with stories of him being rude or otherwise inappropriate to guests and dignitaries at official events, and showing up late and leaving early if he found it boring or just wanted to go do something else. As for the Duchess, I hadn't known that she actually continued on at her job at an art publisher's until her first daughter was born and did this alongside her royal duties. When she was on Duchess duty, at first she seemed unstuffy and a breath of fresh air, but before long her propensity to say the wrong thing, including even suggestive remarks, led to her being viewed as an increasing liability. Lownie notes an occasion when she was also criticised for turning up to a memorial service for the Clapham rail disaster in her soft-top Jaguar, and the criticism her fashion choices and changing waistline took, especially when compared to her sister-in-law, Diana. There was also discomfort with the ways in which the couple were cashing in on their royal status. For instance, they sold pictures of their domestic life to Hello magazine, including Princess Beatrice in the bath, and apparently took the money, meant to go to charity, for Sarah's mother and to pay for extensions to their new house called Sunninghill. This very much reminded me of the Sussexes much later, though they sold access after they'd left the firm and have, to date, kept their children mostly out of it. Other interviews followed, and Sarah also went into publishing, putting out a children's book about a helicopter called Budgie, which wasn't terribly well received and led to accusations that she'd plagiarised a 1964 book called Hector the Helicopter. People said at the time the books wouldn't have been published if they hadn't been written by a duchess, and the whole thing embarrassed the royal family. But I will say that Budgie the Little Helicopter actually became quite a popular cartoon, which one of my friends vaguely remembers watching as a youngster, and when I googled it and heard the startup music, it rang a bell with me too. Apparently Sarah was also complaining about money woes by this point, and other interviews, like with the Today Show, were billed as being for charity, but actually 90% of the money was kept by the couple. It all comes off as very underhanded and smacks of selling their royal connections. And again, I was surprised at the Sussex vibes that I was getting from it and at the fact that this parallel wasn't mentioned by the author. Why have the royal family not cut Sarah in particular loose long before now, though, we might wonder? Lownie argues it's because they worry she'd do a tell-all book about them and it's safer to keep her somewhat close with a modicum of control over her. The breakup of their marriage is covered, as are some sordid details of Sarah's love life, including her overlapping affairs with Steve Wyatt and John Bryan, one of which started during her second pregnancy and which Lownie presents as showing either wild abandon or Machiavellian skills of manipulation over the men in her life, depending on who you ask. The well-known story of the embarrassing pictures of Bryan sucking her toes coming out is covered, of course. There were also some very strange tales of the Duchess obsessing over particular celebrities that she had crushes on, seemingly to the point of almost stalking men like JFK Jr., despite the fact that he was then dating actress Daryl Hannah. Truly, the Duchess comes off as being a bit deranged in this section. Two people who don't appear as much as you might expect in the book are Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, though when they do, what comes across about their childhoods is that they had two very self-absorbed parents, often away on various holidays and money-making trips, and that the girls were dumped on the nanny a lot when the cameras weren't there and were hard for Sarah to control. Andrew apparently missed Princess Eugenie's 12th birthday party to hang out with Jeffrey Epstein, and the Duchess also seems to have supported Princess Beatrice in a wildly inappropriate relationship with an older man who'd been accused of manslaughter, among other things, when the girl was just a teenager, which would suggest she didn't learn much from her own disastrous relationship with Paddy McNally all those years earlier. As for their adult years, Lownie piqued my interest here when he was talking about the daughter's involvement with dodgy Middle Eastern royals and businessmen, as their parents appear, by his account, to have got them in with such people quite young and pretty deep, and they apparently continue to be so to this day. There were even shady characters at their major birthday parties, while senior royals stayed away. There are hints that the princesses may have picked up some negative personality traits and attitudes from the parents too. Supposedly, while Andrew was a not very good patron for the English Royal Ballet, there were plans at one event for children from local schools to be allowed to sit in the royal box, apparently causing one of the princesses to object and say that she only wanted people with her who were the sort of people who shop at John Lewis, which is an expensive department store if you're not familiar with it. Lownie says Andrew also tried to get the ballet company to use an inferior software program to what they already had because it was developed by Princess Eugenie's company, and when they said no, his employee Amanda Thirsk indicated that he wouldn't be working with them as much in the future, not that he'd been very helpful up to that point. There was also a story of trying to get Eugenie on a free MBA course at a London business school in exchange for her father being their patron. The school declined. Having never followed these two women's lives much, this was all news to me, and I wonder if it's part of the reason why they have never been allowed to become full-time working royals. I always assumed it was just because King Charles wants a slimmed-down monarchy and the princesses are tainted by association with their parents, but I walked away from this book wondering if maybe there was more to it, and if the royals are wary of a propensity for poor behaviour and shady financial dealings there too, and want to keep them at a distance because of it. The book doesn't delve into much detail either about relationships between Andrew and Sarah and other working royals, though it's made clear that most of the wider family, from Princess Margaret to Princess Anne, had and have little time for them. Princess Diana's death is dispatched with pretty quickly, and only from Sarah's point of view, where the two are awkwardly described as fourth cousins and long-term friends since adolescence, yet the phrase sisters-in-law is not used. Princes William and Harry really only get a look in a short section that's less than a page and a half in length, and in which it is alleged that Andrew and Harry got into a bust-up in 2013 which left Andrew with a bloody nose, and that the two brothers hate their uncle, with Harry once saying that he planned to kill him, and them both having a variety of names for him, the only one of which I can repeat on YouTube is Twit. These accounts are cited to an anonymous source, however, or private information, as Lownie says in the endnotes, and Prince Harry has expressly denied the bust-up story, calling the statements in the book about this and Andrew's supposedly poor opinion of Meghan Markle gross inaccuracies, damaging and defamatory remarks. Lownie, though, says in interviews that he stands by his source. Throughout the biography, Lownie makes a compelling case for the Yorks' financial illiteracy, massive overspending, and sometimes dodgy money-making schemes, suggesting that these issues were long overlooked or even potentially covered up by those in power. I can't regurgitate everything he claims, but by 1994, Sarah's debts topped $5 million, and I don't know why it's in dollars and not pounds, despite multiple bailouts from the Queen, plenty of lucrative income streams and freebies, and an estimated income of £315,000 per year. Money was being blown before and after their 1992 separation and 1996 divorce on things like first-class holidays, luxury skincare, cars, a huge staff to care for a couple who come off as being unable to do basic tasks like shopping, laundry, cooking and ironing, and of course, lots of security. Andrew would use his position as a member of the royal family and later as a special representative for international trade and investment to make money in the Middle East, associating with members of regimes accused of serious human rights violations, while Sarah was famously caught out selling access to him by a News of the World sting operation. Money she raised, which was supposedly for charity, or which she pledged to charity at least, would also allegedly sometimes get lost in transit somewhere too, not making it to the intended source. Though Lownie does counter this at times by saying that Sarah is very good with people when she is actually doing charity work and brilliant with children in particular. Still, the sheer volume of her commercial ventures, from books to speaking engagements to being a Weight Watchers spokesperson to fronting documentaries, is impressive in its way. And if she was only more financially savvy, she'd have had no problems living within her considerable means, especially as she was back residing with Andrew by 1997 and has continued to do so for most of the time since, in what is one of the stranger aspects of their relationship. My eyes rolled, though, when I read that she supposedly, quote, set up a stall next to the main wedding marquee, promoting her range of teas at Princess Eugenie's wedding in 2018. I'm all for her supporting herself, but if that's true, it's shameful. The sale of her and Andrew's former home, Sunninghill, catches the author's particular attention as an instance of odd financial goings-on. It was sold to the son-in-law of the president of Kazakhstan, who paid £15 million, which was well above the £12 million asking price, despite there being no other interested parties, and the house was later valued at £8 million. Lownie alleges that Andrew had used a complicated tax avoidance scheme to avoid paying 40% capital gains tax, thereby saving himself up to £7 million, despite the fact that the Queen always technically owned the property. The author also excels in laying out such a lengthy list of expenditures on flights, a practice which earned the prince the name Air Miles Andy, that even if you wanted to argue that some of the information was wrong or some of the expenses were justified, it would be exceedingly hard to explain away all or even most of them, and the taxpayers' money seems to have been absolutely squandered at a prodigious rate, all to continue to spoil an already massively overindulged man-child. Again, none of this is actually new information, but it makes for eye-watering reading at times when you see it all laid out at once. As for the couple's relationship with each other, this is undoubtedly very odd. How many people can you think of who were married for just 6 years, split up well over 30 years ago, but continue to live together even as they sometimes engage in relationships with other people? That alone would be enough to justify writing a dual biography of them, despite their long since defunct marriage. Lownie posits that soon after the divorce, there was a point when Prince Andrew was interested in reconciliation, but Sarah was not, and later on, when she might have been open to it, he was not. Instead, they seem to be very good platonic friends, which is perhaps all they ever should have been in the first place, though they are also housemates. Without the ability to interview them or their closest confidants about the relationship, though, the book's discussion of it is inevitably a bit shallow and relies on public statements made by the pair in the past who claim they are divorced to rather than from each other and are very happy with the situation. Something else that comes out in the book, and which I was unaware of, is Sarah's bizarre reliance on psychics, totally discredited ones at that, and her other, sometimes ridiculous beliefs. If Lownie is to be trusted, the Duchess has, at various stages, thought that either she or her daughter Beatrice are the reincarnation of Queen Victoria, that the then Prince Charles would die in a ski accident, and that Andrew would be made regent for Prince William until he came of age. This one was reinforced after Charles was involved in a ski accident that killed his companion. This information is just mentioned in passing, though, which surprised me as I thought more would be made of it. The reincarnation story is unreferenced, however, and as for the ski story, Lownie just says that Sarah's psychics convinced her of this. This is far from the only location in the book where citations really should have been given to reputable sources but weren't, and I felt this was a drawback which made me question what I was being told. That said, Lownie hasn't invented the psychic story, for one of these people, Madame Vasso, eye roll, published a tell-all book about the Duchess in 1996. Thus, once again, we aren't actually getting anything new. Entitled is readable enough and it pulls together a lot of information in one place, but if you're already familiar with the York's backstory, which I wasn't particularly until now, then you're already going to be acquainted with almost all of the main themes in this book, like his womanizing and her financial woes, though granted some of the anecdotes told to support them might be new. And so we come to the whole sordid Epstein scandal. Now, given that this is YouTube and I don't want to be demonetized, I really can't go into a lot of detail about what he and Ghislaine Maxwell were accused and convicted of, nor can I provide details of what Virginia Roberts, later Giuffre, one of the poor girls they got their claws into, said about what Prince Andrew did with her on 3 occasions when she was 17 and 18 years old. However, these stories are so well known at this point that I'm going to assume that you have a good idea of at least the broad strokes of them. Lownie lays out the whole tale again, claiming that Andrew's then private secretary said that the prince knew Epstein from the early 90s, not the late 90s, as the prince has said. But that's the only detail that's really new here. Otherwise, it's just a rehash of information that's been out in the public domain for many years. He believes the infamous photo of Andrew with Virginia and Maxwell in the background is real and casts some seemingly well-founded doubts on the official account of how Epstein died in prison. But if you were hoping for some new bombshell information about the relationship between the Yorks and Epstein and Maxwell, it's not here. Though Lownie's account will certainly confirm for you that the relationship was closer than Andrew would like us to believe, and that he and Sarah are lousy judges of character and easily overawed by super wealthy people. The author is also pretty damning in his assessment of those people and organisations, including the Metropolitan Police, that he and his sources claim are covering for the Duke of York, by ensuring that things like official records for staff members at Buckingham Palace are unavailable. Some of these records even pertain to the day Andrew is meant to have met Virginia Roberts, with one former Royal Protection officer, noted as having an exemplary 23-year career in the Met, saying in an affidavit that much of the evidence that would prove or disprove what Virginia Roberts and I are saying is held by the Metropolitan Police in its Human Resources Department and the Royal Protection Department. These include sickness records, duty rosters, annual leave, advanced security checks, palace appointment books, especially for the North Centre Gate. There must be so many files. With the police, everything is written down. The Epstein story also, I'm afraid, really highlights what I've heard Lownie call in interviews Queen Elizabeth's Achilles heel for her third child. Now, I loved Queen Elizabeth, and I still miss her as monarch, though I think King Charles is doing a fine job. But she was a human being with her flaws like all the rest of us, and well known for not liking conflict and for Andrew being her indulged favourite. Unfortunately, her general failure to rein him in over the decades, a rare misstep in an otherwise exemplary life, had disastrous consequences. Given his apparent personality defects, he might never have been a great man, but had he been mentored and corrected more as he went along, perhaps the worst of his failings could have been avoided. As it was, the Queen had such a blind spot for him that even as the thunderclouds started to gather over his links to Epstein, not to mention the other complaints over the years about Andrew's poor behaviour, she continued to stand by him and give him more honours. By the time Her Majesty had to step in at the urging of Princes Philip, Charles and William after the disastrous Newsnight interview Andrew gave in 2019, from Buckingham Palace by the way, with her consent, and basically fire him from royal duties, the damage was done and it was irreparable. Lownie doesn't lean too heavily into the failings of Andrew's parents, and at the end of the day, the prince has long since been an adult who knows the difference between right and wrong, and we can't just blame everything on his mummy and daddy, but I think this is nevertheless a cautionary tale about the dangers of spoiling children. He also claims Andrew's behaviour caused a negative ripple effect when the Duchess of Sussex was accused of bullying palace staff members, noting that the report on Markle has never been released, some say because it would also raise questions about the behaviour of the Queen's second son. The Queen's willingness to let the Prince and Sarah have royal lodge continues to be a headache for King Charles and Prince William too, who clearly want the former couple out of this mansion on the Windsor estate, and Lownie says that it remains a mystery how Andrew has been able to enjoy such an extravagant lifestyle without any obvious sources of income beyond his naval pension, family money he may have inherited, and handouts first from Queen Elizabeth and now King Charles. Lastly, there were some random bits of information dropped in here or there in this book, which I thought had the potential to be better explored, such as the fact that the Duchess nearly died in the attacks on the Twin Towers, only surviving because she was late for a meeting in one of them that day. That to me is a big deal and the kind of thing which could have a real impact on a person, but we hear no more about it. Then there was her mother's death in a truly horrific car crash in 1998, again something which it's hard to believe didn't have a huge impact on Sarah, but which is barely discussed. My final take on this book is that it's a breezy enough read, divided up into 8 main chapters, which are then divided into countless little subheadings, making it very easy to digest. You should be able to get through it in a weekend if you want to, but it's not something you're likely to reach for a reread. To get 4 or 5 stars from me, you really need to write something that changes the narrative around a certain topic or person and gives us something very new, and the book just doesn't do that. It doesn't add much to the story of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson in my view. instead largely repackaging information already out there and fleshing it out a bit. It didn't change my opinion of them for the most part, though learning about some of the less pleasant things which happened to them in their youth did garner some sympathy at times, and at least offered a window into the development of their personalities. I went into this thinking that they are two not terribly bright people, both poor judges of character and greedy, that he especially is spoilt and very full of himself and rude, and that she is an absolute idiot when it comes to money and the people she allows into her orbit. I came out thinking the same things, albeit with a few more anecdotes to support my opinions. It's quite well researched, though there's a lot that's missing, some of it unavoidably, and I have no doubt that other books in the future will be able to provide more details and nuance as more information comes out. The problem with books, shows and movies about living people is that they go out of date very quickly, and I doubt this will be any different. Prince Harry's memoir Spare made a big splash because it revealed hitherto unknown or only suspected details about the royals, and whether you love him or loathe him, you can't deny that the information in it came straight from the horse's mouth. Lownie's book just doesn't have that level of access or shock value, and I thought that some of the instances where he did have something new or interesting to talk about were opportunities missed in favour of running us through things we already know about the likes of the Epstein saga. I'm sure it'll still make him a very healthy return on the time he's invested in it, however, but I don't think it's going to go down in the annals of history as a groundbreaking work. Depending on whether you're particularly interested in the subject matter, I'm giving it 2 to 2.5 stars out of 5. Let me know in the comments if you'll be reading Entitled or not and why, and if you would be so kind, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on to stay up to date with everything History Calling. For more on the Windsors, try one of these options next, and until next time, keep learning.